In the summer of 2007, the streets of Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine, became a hunting ground for two seemingly average 19-year-old boys. Viktor Sayenko and Igor Suprunyuk weren't gang members, escaped convicts, or the products of poverty. They came from stable homes, they went to school, they played video games. But for 21 days, they transformed into something unrecognizable. Cold, methodical killers who left behind a trail of mutilated bodies and unanswered questions. What made this case infamous wasn't just the number of victims, 21 dead in less than a month, or how brutally they were murdered, often with hammers, pipes, or screwdrivers. It was what they filmed. Chilling, grainy footage surfaced of one of the murders, a single video that would go viral under the name 3 Guys, 1 Hammer, shocking millions around the world and igniting debates over whether evil is born or made. The police were baffled. The public was terrified. And the motive? That's where things get even darker, because these boys didn't kill for money, revenge, or even hate. They murdered people to feel something. And according to court records, they wanted to build a snuff film empire to get rich off murder. This is the story of how two privileged teenagers became some of the most sadistic serial killers of the 21st century, and how their crimes, recorded, shared, and still circulating in the darkest corners of the internet, changed the true crime world forever. This is the story of the Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs. When boys become monsters. Born just weeks apart in the spring of 1988, Viktor Sayenko, Igor Suprunyuk, and Alexander Hansa were inseparable from a young age, the kind of tight-knit trio that often forms in childhood and carries into adolescence with an ease that seems almost predestined. They grew up in Dnipropetrovsk, today called Dnipro, Ukraine's fourth largest city, a sprawling industrial hub where Soviet legacy still lingered in the architecture and the mindset of many who lived there. By all outward appearances, their childhoods were unremarkable in the best possible way. If anything, they might have been considered privileged by the standards of post-Soviet Eastern Europe. Viktor's father was a lawyer, one with enough influence and loyalty to later stand by his son as legal counsel during the most public and horrifying moment of his life, the murder trial that would come to define him. Igor's father, Vladimir, worked as a commercial pilot and occasionally flew none other than Ukraine's second president, Leonid Kuchma, suggesting the family had connections that reached into the highest tiers of the country's elite. There were even whispers of ties to law enforcement, the sort of quiet alliances that might not mean much until, suddenly, they do. These boys didn't grow up cold or hungry. They weren't fending for themselves on the streets or navigating broken homes. They had shelter, they had food, they had access to education and, for the most part, a future paved ahead of them. And yet, it's that very comfort, the absence of urgent need, that may have created the space for something darker to take root. There's an old saying, idle hands are the devil's playground. When survival isn't a struggle, the mind is free to wander. And for Viktor and Igor, that wandering took them to places far more sinister than anyone could have predicted.
Death comes sweeping down. Filthy death, the leering clown. Death on wings, death by surprise. Veiling evil from worldly eyes.
In their early teens, Viktor and Igor were not what anyone would describe as popular. Whether by their own admission or later claims shaped by the pressures of trial and notoriety, they painted a picture of themselves as outsiders, socially isolated, frequently bullied, and trapped in a quiet, constant state of fear. How much of that was true remains unclear, and some have suggested these claims were manufactured or at least exaggerated in an attempt to garner sympathy once their crimes came to light. Still, suppose their version of events is to be believed. In that case, the journey from quiet boys to killers begins not with violence, but with vulnerability, specifically a shared fear that would come to define the earliest steps of their descent.
Мотив – болезненное самоутверждение. Игорь Супруnyuk и Виктор Саенко свою вину не признали. Прокурор требует для них пожизненного заключения. Александру Ганже грозит 14 лет.
When they were about 14, Viktor and Igor discovered that they both suffered from an intense fear of heights, a phobia that felt, to them, like a glaring weakness. In the hypermasculine culture of their environment, where toughness was currency and fear was equated with failure, this was something they couldn't easily tolerate in themselves. It made them feel small, ashamed, less than. Viktor, in particular, sought advice from older boys he admired. Teenagers who carried themselves with confidence and a casual sort of danger that seemed intoxicating to someone still trying to find his place in the world. The advice he received was simple, almost cliché. If you're afraid of something, face it, stare it down, dominate it until it doesn't have power over you anymore. And so, with that guidance echoing in their heads, the boys made a plan. One afternoon, they climbed to the 14th floor of a high-rise apartment building where one of their families lived. At first, they merely stepped out onto the balcony, peering over the edge with their hearts pounding in their throats, their legs unsteady beneath them. The fear was real, physical, almost paralyzing, but they didn't retreat. Instead, as the minutes passed and their bodies adjusted, they did something far more reckless. They climbed over the railing and let themselves dangle. Hanging there, suspended over nothing but the dizzying drop to the ground below, they felt the panic give way to something new. Adrenaline, pride, a rush of invincibility. They didn't fall. They pulled themselves back up, and they did it again, and again, until eventually, the fear they'd once carried with them began to dissolve, not through gradual healing, but through repeated exposure to danger. In their minds, they hadn't just faced a fear, they'd conquered it. And that victory tasted good. It made them feel powerful for the first time in their lives. It made them feel untouchable. And it left them craving more. The rush they had felt, the thrill of dangling over death and surviving it, wasn't something they could keep to themselves for long. It was too powerful, too intoxicating, and they wanted to share it. So Viktor and Igor brought their friend Alexander into the fold. He was quieter than the other two, softer in ways that set him apart. Alexander Hansa had always been the most sensitive of the trio, more fragile in both body and mind, and it didn't take much to unsettle him. He had a visceral fear of blood, the kind that made his stomach turn and his skin prickle at the sight of even a small cut. He was afraid to bathe his own pet guinea pig, convinced he might scald it with hot water. To outsiders, these quirks may have seemed harmless, maybe even endearing, but to Viktor and Igor, they were weaknesses, signs that Alexander hadn't yet evolved into what they were becoming. Viktor, emboldened by his own transformation, believed there was a solution. The path forward, he said, was simple. Alexander needed to confront his fears the same way they had. He needed to see blood, not just a little, but a lot, and he needed to inflict pain, to feel what it meant to dominate something vulnerable, to break it and survive the aftermath. Only then, Viktor argued, would he shed the shame he carried. Only then would he be free. It wasn't long before the boys began wandering the wooded outskirts of their neighborhood in the hours after school, their pockets filled with dog treats and scraps of food. At first glance, they might have looked like any group of teenage boys killing time before dinner, but they had a purpose, a plan. They used those treats to lure stray dogs toward them, calling out softly, crouching low, pretending to be kind. And when the animals came, tails wagging, unaware, they were met not with kindness, but with cruelty. What happened next was unspeakable. They tortured those animals, then murdered them, and they made sure to document every moment. This was the early 2000s, the dawn of social media and digital cameras, when teenagers across the globe were beginning to share the most mundane and the most grotesque parts of their lives online. Viktor, Igor, and Alexander didn't want to be left behind. They filmed everything, cataloging their acts like twisted trophies. Each new video became a symbol of how far they had come and how far they were willing to go. In their own minds, they had become something more than human. No longer frightened boys hiding behind phobias and insecurities, They were now 17 years old, physically stronger, emotionally detached, and wholly consumed by the sense of power that came from deciding when a life should end. They spoke with more authority, walked with their heads higher. They believed they were evolving, and as their confidence grew, so did their aggression. At school, the transformation was visible. The same boys who once cowered in the shadows of bullies were now the ones doing the bullying. There was no clearer example than the day Igor spotted a bike he liked. Nothing special, just a teenager's ride. But he wanted it. He beat up the kid who owned it, stole it, and sold it to Viktor as if it were nothing more than a transaction. It was bold, it was sloppy, and they got caught. The incident was recorded in the school's disciplinary file, maybe even on a local police report, but there were no real consequences. They were 17, still technically children. No jail time, no lasting record. Just a warning, a slap on the wrist, and a chance to move on. And they did move on, right past the point of no return, because by the time they graduated, they weren't content with animals anymore. The making of a killer brand. After finishing school, the trio didn't rush off into adult life with ambition or purpose. They each dabbled in various jobs, but these weren't careers. They were distractions, placeholders to pass the time while their real thoughts drifted elsewhere. Viktor took a short-lived position as a security guard, a job that offered him the illusion of authority, though he never spoke of it with any pride. Alexander found work in construction, and later, in an almost jarring twist, tried his hand at pastry making, delicate, precise, artistic. But it was Igor who found something more useful, something that would eventually become part of their plan. That year, 2007, Igor was given a gift, a green Daewoo Lanos, a compact European-style sedan, forgettable in its appearance but reliable enough to carry them through the city's winding streets. This was long before the rise of ride-sharing apps or official gig work. But Igor, ever practical when it came to bending the rules, slapped some makeshift checkerboard decals onto the car, transforming it into an unlicensed taxi. It wasn't legal, but in post-Soviet Ukraine, it didn't have to be. As long as his passengers paid in cash, no one asked questions. And for a while, that was enough. But enough had long since disappeared from their vocabulary. Soon, Igor realized there was more to be gained than a few hryvnias per ride. If someone trusted him enough to get into his car alone, what was stopping him from taking everything they had? He shared the idea with Viktor and Alexander, and they embraced it without hesitation. They began robbing passengers, anyone they thought they could overpower or intimidate. It was opportunistic, calculated, and increasingly bold. Still, it wasn't enough. The money came in, but not in the volumes they dreamed of. Their conversations turned obsessive, always circling back to wealth, power, notoriety. The answer, when it finally came, felt obvious. Their next evolution wouldn't be robbery, it would be murder. And they wouldn't just kill for thrill, they would kill for profit. The plan, as later described by witnesses and hinted at in media reports, was disturbingly simple. Film the murders, create a collection of snuff videos, and sell them to a foreign contact, an alleged buyer who operated in the darker corners of the internet and was willing to pay handsomely for footage soaked in real blood. It was a get-rich-quick scheme born of both cruelty and delusion, and on June 25, 2007, they put it into motion. That evening, 33-year-old Yarina Ilchenko was returning home from a quiet tea with a friend. She lived with her family in one of Dnipro's many sprawling apartment complexes, familiar with the route and the shadows along the sidewalk. She was not doing anything out of the ordinary. She wasn't taking risks. She was simply walking home, unaware that two young men were approaching from the opposite direction. Two young men who had decided she would die that night. Igor walked beside Viktor, a hammer hidden in his sleeve, his grip tight, his breathing steady. When they passed Ilchenko, he didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, lifted the weapon, and brought it down hard on the side of her head. She collapsed instantly, but he wasn't finished. He delivered several more blows before fleeing into the darkness. It was a random killing, the kind that leaves no trail, no motive, just shock and blood and silence. The next morning, it was Yarina's own mother who found her, crumpled on the pavement just outside the building, her face swollen, her head split open. The horror of that moment would live with her for the rest of her life, a nightmare she could never unsee. But the killers weren't done. Still high on adrenaline, Viktor needed to strike. They wandered the area until they came across Roman Tatarovich, a man sleeping on a park bench, completely unaware of the danger standing over him. Without a word, Viktor raised his weapon and brought it crashing down onto the man's skull. And just like that, the spree had begun. In their eyes, this wasn't just violence. It was business. It was branding. They believed they were building something. A catalog of death, raw and unfiltered, to be sold like currency to someone who appreciated its worth. They saw the killings as a product, and themselves as producers. The Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs had taken their first steps into a world no sane person could comprehend, and they were only getting started. You have to remember, the internet as it existed in 2007 wasn't what it is today. Curated, policed, and algorithmically sanitized. Back then, it felt closer to the Wild West, an uncharted digital frontier where anything could be uploaded, shared, or discovered if you knew where to look. Shock sites like Rotten.com and LiveLeak weren't just tolerated, they were revered by a certain corner of the online world, a community that fed off the grotesque, the graphic, and the utterly inhumane. Gore was currency, and the more disturbing the content, the more virality it carried. This was also the era when Two Girls, One Cup went from underground fetish horror to full-blown internet legend, not because of the video itself, but because of the wave of reaction videos it spawned. People gathered around computers in bedrooms and basements to film their friends' faces as they watched, recoiled, and gagged in disbelief. It became a twisted rite of passage for the YouTube generation. Viktor, Igor, and Alexander understood this landscape well. They weren't just killing, they were building a product. In their warped minds, they were cornering a market, carving out a niche in the darkest corners of the internet. While others posted videos of car crashes or wartime executions, they were walking the streets of Dnipro armed with a hammer and a camera, capturing death in real time. According to testimony from one of the suspect's girlfriends during the trial, the plan was to create 40 separate murder videos, each one more brutal than the last. It wasn't about the victims. It wasn't even really about the money anymore. This was about notoriety, about control. Killing was no longer a means to an end. It had become the entertainment itself. By July 1st, just 5 days after the murder of Yarina Ilchenko and Roman Tatarovich, 2 more bodies were discovered. Yevgenia Grishenko and Nikolai Serchuk had both been found on the street. There was no attempt to conceal the crime scenes, no effort to cover their tracks. The killers wanted the bodies to be found. They wanted fear to spread, and it did. 13 days, 13 dead. 5 days later, the trio struck again, this time leaving behind a trail of 3 more victims in a single night. The first was a young man recently discharged from the military, walking home after a night out, unaware that death was waiting just around the corner. Then came a female security guard, 28 years old, struck down just blocks away, and finally, a mother of 3, a woman doing her best to hold her family together while caring for a disabled husband, was murdered without mercy. The authorities were desperate, overwhelmed by the randomness and speed of the killings. There were no connections between the victims, no shared routines, no pattern to trace. The attacks happened at night, in different neighborhoods, with no consistent motive beyond the act itself. People began avoiding the streets. Mothers gripped their children tighter, and the killers kept moving. Then, on July 7th, something changed. It was a warm, clear day in the nearby town of Podhorodne, and 2 14-year-old boys, Andrei Sidyuk and Vadim Liakov, had gone out to fish along the Kilin River, choosing a quiet spot near the woods where they could talk, laugh, and enjoy the summer sun. It should have been safe. It should have been just another afternoon. But the killers were already there. No one knows exactly how it happened, only that it did. Quick, brutal, and silent. Andrei was attacked first, struck down without warning. His young life ended in seconds. Vadim saw everything. Frozen in horror, he did the only thing he could. He ran. Scrambling through the brush, heart racing, he managed to disappear into the woods. Somehow, against all odds, he survived. Vadim made it to the police and told them what had happened, that his friend was dead, that someone had attacked them. But trauma has a way of warping memory. The boy was in shock, barely able to speak, and when his answers didn't line up the way investigators expected, they began to question him. He was just a child who had witnessed a murder and barely escaped with his life. But instead of being protected, he found himself at the center of suspicion. The investigators, frustrated by a lack of leads and overwhelmed by the mounting body count, began to wonder if Vadim himself was the killer. What followed was a betrayal as cruel as the attack itself. A victim turned into a suspect, a survivor treated like a criminal. Instead of protecting him, the authorities arrested Vadim. They denied him access to legal counsel, isolated him, and subjected him to repeated beatings, hoping that fear and pain would force a confession. But nothing surfaced. The boy, bruised and disoriented, could barely repeat what he had already told them. And slowly, the officers began to understand what should have been clear from the beginning, that if he had known anything more, he would have said it by now. Eventually, they stopped. They apologized, half-heartedly perhaps, and began working with Vadim instead of against him. With his help, they sketched crude renderings of the attackers' faces blurred by trauma, but sketched with the urgency of a town under siege. The images were printed and plastered across walls and bulletin boards, pinned to shopfront windows and telephone poles. But the killings did not stop. On July 12th, another male victim was found. 2 days later, a woman riding her scooter was knocked off balance, then beaten to death in the street. And then came the tidal wave. 13 more bodies in the days that followed. Men, women, the elderly, the disabled, even children. People chosen not for who they were, but for what they weren't. Strong, armed, capable of fighting back. These were soft targets. The trio didn't want a challenge. They wanted certainty. Some of the victims were robbed, stripped of valuables, but many were left untouched. The motives weren't financial, not really. They did these horrible things because they wanted to, and they wanted to often. Caught but not forgotten. Despite having a dedicated task force, the police were chasing shadows. There was no pattern to follow, no shared occupation or neighborhood or habit to stitch together. The murders were spread across districts, times of day, and classes of people. Unless they caught the killers in the act, there was little hope of predicting what would happen next. Then, on July 23rd, they got lucky. Igor entered a local pawn shop, looking to sell a cell phone. It was a routine act, the kind of errand any teenager might run to scrape together a few extra bills. But when the shop owner powered on the device to ensure it worked, an alert pinged the local police. The phone had been stolen from one of the victims. Moments later, officers swarmed the shop. Igor was arrested right then and there, just steps from the cash register. From that point forward, the dominoes fell quickly. Viktor and Alexander were picked up soon after. The interrogations were brief. There was no grand deception, no scramble to deny the truth. The boys confessed, coldly, clearly, without remorse. Their phones and computers were seized and searched. What they found was worse than expected. There were photos, hundreds of them, victims in various stages of torture, selfies taken in front of fresh graves, screenshots of news articles, images of funeral services the boys had attended, not as mourners, but as spectators. In some, they posed with middle fingers extended in front of coffins and tombstones, grinning ear to ear. Igor had collected newspaper clippings about their crimes and printed out photographs of the deceased. Underneath one of the bodies, he had scrawled a message in pen. "The weak must die. the strongest will conquer. It was a manifesto of sorts, a reminder of their earliest experiment with fear, those days spent hanging off a balcony, daring gravity to let go. Back then, overcoming fear had made them feel powerful. Now, they believed they had become more than human. They would never go back to being victims again. One of the videos recovered by investigators was played in court. It was titled, "Three Guys, One Hammer," a grotesque nod to the shock videos of the era. In 4 minutes of pure horror, it showed the murder of 48-year-old Sergei Yatsenko, a man with no connection to the boys, beaten and death with a hammer and screwdriver. They took turns, laughing as they plunged the tools into his skull and face. At one point, they covered his head with a plastic bag to muffle the sounds. When it was over, they calmly rinsed their hands with bottled water and chatted, amused at how long the man had held on before dying. There was no rage, no urgency, only fascination. Watching it wasn't just disturbing, it was devastating, because it stripped away any illusion that these were confused or misguided teenagers. What it showed was complete emotional detachment, a vacuum of empathy, a celebration of suffering. In the end, the justice system responded with what force it could. Alexander Hansa, who had participated in the robberies and helped lure some of the early victims, was sentenced to 9 years in prison. He was not convicted of the murders themselves, and in 2019, he walked free. In an interview after his release, he reflected on his former friends with a sentence that rang hollow and helpless. "If I had known the atrocities they were capable of, I would have never gone near them." Igor Suprunyuk and Viktor Sayenko were not so lucky. They were convicted on 21 counts of murder, 8 armed robberies, and 1 count of animal cruelty. The court sentenced them to life in prison. They have filed appeals. All have failed. And it is likely, happily, deservedly, that they will die behind bars. So, what are we left with? Were these 2 boys the result of psychopathy, sociopathy, or were they, in some terrible way, a product of their time? A time when the internet was still too new to understand, too wild to control, and too tempting for those who wanted to push its limits. Would they have turned out differently had they been born 10 years later or 10 years earlier? It's impossible to say, and maybe it doesn't matter, because what they did, what they recorded, what they laughed through, cannot be undone. And the only comfort, thin and bitter as it may be, is that they were caught and the spree finally ended.
Как только велосипедист приблизился, я нанес ему удар в область головы молотком. Да чистосердечное признание.
In the end, the tale of the Dnipropetrovsk Maniacs stands as a bleak reminder of how ordinary faces can mask unimaginable cruelty, and how the desire for power, when left unchecked, can mutate into something monstrous. These weren't boys shaped by desperation or born into violence. They were raised with comfort, given choices, and still chose chaos. What they did cannot be rationalized, only remembered. It's a story not just of lives taken, but of lives wasted, of a society caught off guard. Their victims deserved more, and while justice may have stopped the killing, it can never truly undo the terror left behind.